Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to OTA on the Air, presented to you by Transport Services. Transport Services is a full-service semi-trailer dealer with locations in Cleveland and Columbus. Since its inception in 1976, Transport Services has grown to over 80 employees and is continuing to expand. Transport Services focuses on bringing their customers value by offering trailer rental, equipment sales of new and used trailers, mobile repair, 30+ service bays, and a parts distribution service as well. For more information, go to www.transportservices.com or contact Brian Brook at 330-573-0401. With us today is Andrew Huffman, who is the Director of Legislative Affairs for Governmental Policy Group. And Governmental Policy Group is a 30+-year-old lobbying firm in Columbus, who is employed by the Ohio Trucking Association to represent us since 2014. So Andrew, welcome a lot for being with us on the show.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for everyone signing on. Like Tom said, Andrew Huffman with Governmental Policy Group. Tom and I were talking before this, and our firm, we have over 150 years of combined experience amongst the lobbyists. And I will tell you that none of us have ever experienced anything like what we're experiencing right now with the pandemic. Certainly it's impacted all of your businesses, and it's impacted how we go about advocating at the State House and working with Ohio's lawmakers as they make decisions and try to navigate through this process. So I'm going to give you an overview of what's occurred over the last few months, how the Ohio General Assembly has responded, and what to expect moving forward. And before I dive into any specific legislation, I wanted to give everyone an overview of where we are in the legislative process. We are in the 133rd General Assembly and the second year of the legislative session. And typically in the beginning of the second year of any legislative session, it's somewhat quiet, and I say they pass feel-good bills, and I say that because typically during the spring legislative session of the second year of the General Assembly, lawmakers are passing things like the capital budget, a bill that gives funding back to local communities to build things and put people to work. And the reason they do those type of bills is because we have an election coming up quickly. And bills like that look good in the community, and it makes lawmakers show value to their districts. So that was all turned upside down with the outbreak of the pandemic. And you're all aware of the governor's actions and what Ohio has done to try to limit the impact of the virus. It all started in early March when the governor declared a state of emergency. Then all schools and mass gatherings were closed and limited on March 12th. And then you started seeing more and more businesses and industries shut down. And the first stay-at-home order was issued on March 23rd, and it essentially closed all non-essential businesses and limited all non-essential activity. Now, since then, and really near the end of April, we've seen the governor reopen industries and reopen businesses, and what he called the Responsible Restart Ohio plan. And since then, we have seen more and more open. We're getting back to where most industries are open right now, but there's certainly some restrictions. Certain precautions like social distancing and sanitation practices are required. Now, the governor has received some heat from the business community and from some lawmakers that he hasn't done enough to reopen Ohio and get business back to normal. But I think we're going to start seeing more and more open up. There's a looming second wave of the virus coming. I'm sure you have all heard that. That's certainly out there and something that Ohio will need to address when and if it does come about. In the near future, though, I would expect to see some announcements on education and reopening schools. You know, we're about 2 months away from schools starting back up, and what that looks like is still relatively unknown at this point. And so I think the governor, maybe as early as today, will announce his plan on how schools need to go about reopening. And you may ask me why I'm talking about schools reopening on an OTA webinar, but I think whatever schools decide to do, it's certainly going to impact employees and what they're able to do and what their workspace looks like. If schools are only opening up part-time to where they have students in the building part-time and the other half of the week, those students are home learning on a computer, that's certainly going to impact employees and what their flexibility and how they're able to function as well. So I really think this education announcement is going to have an impact on employees and businesses overall and how they are able to reopen and function moving forward. We may also see an announcement on the 10-person max gathering. I know that limitation has really put many groups in a difficult position. I know Tom and I have talked numerous times how it's difficult to run an association when you can't have more than 10 members in a room. It makes it difficult. So we'll see some announcements over the coming months, and certainly watch those closely.
So have you guys gotten any indication on the school openings? I know that like Illinois had said that they were going to open up schools again with certain precautions. Have you guys gotten any word or has there been any leakage about what they're thinking?
The governor has announced that he's going to leave a lot of responsibility on the local school districts. And that's probably smart. You know, what works in Cuyahoga County may not work down in Meigs County. And so I think you need to give local governments or local entities that authority. So I think you're going to see that. There's some pending legislation right now dealing with that as well that would essentially prohibit the governor from closing schools moving forward and leave that decision up to local school boards. So I think you're going to see a lot of local control, Tom.
Well, obviously the stay-at-home order had a gigantic impact on business, and depending on which sector of the business world you're in, had huge impact. You know, we saw the fuel haulers off 80% in some cases because no one was driving anywhere and no one was working. So, what does the impact have when it comes to state revenues? Because obviously, people aren't shopping. People aren't buying goods and services. There's no revenue coming in. So give us an update on where the state's revenue source is and what some of the thinking is about how to fill that gap.
Yeah, like all businesses out there, the state has felt the impact of the pandemic as well in their pocketbook. Headed into the final month of fiscal year 2020, June, right now, total tax receipts were below estimates by over $1 billion. And so to balance that, the governor had to cut $775 million really across the board. I think every state agency was hit with the exception of the Department of Corrections. Education actually received a $300 million hit. So they took a brunt of the cuts. And that was done to balance this year's books. Tom, looking ahead, we have a $2.5 billion hole for fiscal year 2021. And lawmakers are going to have to address that issue, I would suspect, after the election. No elected official wants to go into an election after cutting or raising taxes to make up for a $2.5 billion hole. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that addressed after the November election. Fortunately, Ohio is sitting on what's called a rainy day fund of $2.7 billion. And that money came from previous General Assemblies when the economy was good. We were wisely putting money away into this fund for a rainy day, and it is certainly raining. Looking at motor fuel tax revenues, we asked ODOT recently to give us an idea compared to last year, how are the fuel tax revenues looking. Gas revenues from the gas tax, it's down 37%. Diesel revenue is down 21%, and overall fuel tax revenue is down 33%. So that has certainly taken a hit. Obviously, that was on the heels of a motor fuel tax increase. Certainly, right. ODOT expected, and I can't imagine what local governments wanted to see either.
Yeah, and that was an interesting conversation that we had with ODOT about their revenue. Is, you know, they saw that, you know, traffic counts were down in the 60% range for a long period of time, and Yeah, I mean, their revenues are down and they're off, but they're off a lot less than what they would be if that tax increase would not have been put into place on the fuel tax. So how does I mean, because I guess the thing is from a state revenue perspective, you got sales tax, but then you also have income tax um, as part of that option. But there, I think the interesting part is the delayed payments on, pushing out the income tax filing date to the middle of July. What sort of impact that has, and if they go back to that, are they going to go back to an April 15th date for next year? And can they make that up in income tax, or is sales tax where they got to hit it, even though sales taxes may be off just because people aren't buying as much?
Yeah. How they move forward, that's the $2.5 billion question. They're going to tap into the rainy day fund at some point, and I really don't see this legislature raising taxes. Now they might look at some tax expenditures, some what they call loopholes to try to make up the lost revenue, but the Ohio legislature is controlled by Republicans and Republicans that don't want to raise taxes. So I don't see taxes being raised. They'll probably try to find a different way to balance the books, I would imagine.
So, one thing that they did do was they did House Bill 197 for the COVID response. I guess let the listeners know a little bit about what was involved in that package.
Yeah. So this bill, like Tom said, House Bill 197, it was signed on March 27th, and it started off as a really non-controversial tax code cleanup bill introduced by Representative Derek Barron. But it was amended on the Senate floor with some significant changes, dozens and dozens of changes responding to the pandemic. Just a few that I wanted to hit. It extended absentee voting for the primary election on March 27th, all the way to April 28th. I'm sure many of the viewers understood the confusion surrounding the primary election. No one really knew, was it on, was it off? Do I have to vote by mail? Do I show up to the polling locations? What do I do? There was so much confusion, and I hope Ohio learns from its mistake. I'll call it a mistake, but it was just confusion leading up to the November election. And we'll see what happens with the second spike that we're expected to get, but I hope we have a better plan going forward for the November election, because it really was confusing for the primary election of March. 197 also extended, like you said, Tom, Ohio's tax filing deadline to July 15th. That was to align with the federal filing deadline. And it also, and I know this is going to make the hair on your neck stand up, Tom, it made some changes, essentially putting certain components of the governor's executive orders into uncodified or temporary law dealing with unemployment compensation. So it eliminated the work search requirement during the declared public health emergency, and it eliminated the 1 week waiting period during the declared health emergency as well. So certainly unemployment compensation, that's an issue that we'll talk about here in a little bit. It has been, it's really been strained, and some of the decisions have certainly dug us a hole that we will need to get out of here in the near future. Another provision in 197, it extended the expiration dates on certain licenses to 90 days after the declared emergency ends, or December 1st, whichever is first. This really was kind of spearheaded by the OTA. We were asking questions like, what happens if a CDL expires? Where do I get it renewed? BMVs are being closed. What do we do? So they took those questions and turned it into a policy solution for really all licenses out there, and just extended the expiration dates. And I think it's worked fairly well.
Yeah, and that was, an interesting part. It shows the power of what the association can do. I mean, that we were going in on specifically CDLs, and it made so much sense that, the Ohio legislature, it made it effective to all licenses. So medical licenses and dental licenses and all the licensures that is there. It just kind of shows that, we brought up an issue that is specific to the industry that had, universal effects. So you talked a little bit about unemployment comp. I think the last report I heard was the unemployment compensation system has paid out over $4 billion worth of payments. That we've got that going out there, 700 and some odd thousand claimants You know, the interesting part is at some point someone's gonna have to pay that back, right? And so the state of Ohio took out a $3.2 billion loan from the federal government, which we did back in 08, 09. That we as the employers got tagged with that penalty. Let's talk a little bit about unemployment comp, some of the things the legislature is doing on that piece, and is this a hole we ever get ourselves dug out of?
No, it was a hole that shouldn't have been as deep for, gosh, Tom, how many years ever since the recession, ever since we paid off that debt that you were talking about from the Great Recession back in 2016. And to talk about that a little bit, so when we borrowed, I think at the time it was $3.4 billion to get out of to pay off unemployment compensation claims back in 2008. That loan was finally paid off in 2016. And like Tom said, businesses were paying a penalty and an interest on that loan from the federal government. It was the trucking association that went to the state legislature and said, hey, we have millions of dollars sitting in unclaimed funds. Let's use that money to pay off the federal debt so businesses aren't getting hit with this penalty. And by doing that, we ended up saving businesses hundreds of millions of dollars in these federal penalties. So we face a similar situation. And for years, we've been clamoring, we need to make the fund solvent. We need to bring changes to the entire unemployment compensation system. What's being paid in, what's being paid out. And the legislature has not acted on that. And it was us, along with the other business associations out there. And hopefully, if any good comes from this, this may be the kickstart that lawmakers needed to say, hey, when we get over this, we need to make our fund solvent. We need to do something different to avoid another situation where we have to borrow from the feds when there's a downturn in the economy. So what has the legislature done? The Ohio Senate recently introduced Senate Joint Resolution 4 in response to the expectation that we're going to have to borrow from the federal government. So what this resolution would do, it would allow the General Assembly to place an issue on the November 3rd, 2020 ballot that would essentially approve obligations to repay any federal loans for Ohio's unemployment compensation system. This is similar to what's used in Texas, and essentially it's allowing us to issue a bond to repay the federal debt, and it allows Ohio a bit more control on what fees and interest they need to pay. And Ohio would only do this if they can get a better interest rate, and it is better for businesses to issue these obligations as opposed to just borrowing from the federal government. So again, they look back at 2008, what we had to do, the penalties that businesses had to pay, and hopefully, if this were to pass, it would save long-term businesses from paying those penalties. On the House side, they've introduced House Bill 614. It's slightly different. This bill is aimed at studying and reforming the application process and really the administration of Ohio's unemployment compensation system. Lawmakers were just flooded over the past 3 months with criticism and concerns about applicants receiving their unemployment comp benefits. The system was just flooded with claims. They didn't really do a great job of responding to questions. I know employers had questions as well. And so what this bill would do, it would create a modernization and improvement council that would evaluate the claim filing process and really look at the technology. It's my understanding that the technology at JFS is really outdated. It's taken quite some time. They started updating the technology under the Kasich administration, and it hasn't been finalized yet. So they're looking at that technology infrastructure, trying to update that. This council that's being created is going to try to look at how to make JFS more responsive to applicants and inquiries that come in. So hopefully that'll, I guess, expedite the claim process and just make the agency as a whole more responsive.
So with Senate Joint Resolution 4 being the way it is, it does not have a traditional path in that the legislature, both chambers, approve and the governor signs and it becomes law. that this is something that has to be voted on by the public. It has to go to a general ballot election piece. What are the chances of that getting done and on the November ballot? And then after that, what's the next window to be able to get that particular piece put into place?
So there have been some questions about whether it even needs to go on the ballot, since these bonds wouldn't be backed by the full faith and credit of Ohio. It would be backed by payments made by employers. There's some questions out there that whether it even needs to go to the ballot. Some folks don't even think that's necessary. So that's a question. Heck, Tom, you might have received it when you testified on the resolution. They don't even know if it has to go to the ballot. So that's something that is being worked out. The House will need to act on this resolution. I'm hearing that the House also has their own plan, kind of in the same vein, that has yet to be introduced. So the timeline is tight. We have 4 months to get something done and get something on the ballot if that's the route they go. And unfortunately, it's just an unknown right now if the House will come back on and act on this.
Yeah, and without question, the JFS got pushed to its absolute limits during this with the number of claimants that came in. I think it was over 1 million claims that came in, and they were doing some things that a lot of our folks have struggled with, in that they basically said everyone gets approved, and it's all COVID response. So they basically were handing this stuff out to anybody, regardless of work history, regardless of any of that. So, I think House Bill 614 is a good piece. I think it's one of those things that's over. It should have been done years ago. But definitely the workers' compensation system needs some serious reform done moving forward. So for those of us who are considered essential businesses and kept people employed during this, obviously there's some concern from employers about, what happens if I have an employee or a customer get sick, and they try to pin it back on me. So let's talk a little bit about the actions of civil immunity that are in place and where those are at.
Yeah, this is key as well, Tom. Not only for those essential businesses, but as businesses look to reopen, there's many out there that are concerned about getting sued. These lawsuits stemming from individuals claiming that they were exposed to COVID-19 at an entity's, at someone's business, and what happened. So the legislature's working on 2 bills: Senate Bill 308, introduced by Senator Matt Huffman, and House Bill 606, introduced by Representative Grandel. Both are aimed at providing immunity to businesses for the transmission and exposure to COVID-19, really, unless the business acted with reckless or intentional misconduct. The immunity would be retroactive, so it would be dated all the way back to the beginning of the emergency, March 9th. I will tell you that House Bill 606 has received a bit of pushback from the business community, including the Trucking Association, because on the House floor, they added some language that would give workers in certain food establishments and certain first responders access to workers' compensation if they contracted COVID-19 while on the job. And this new presumption that's created really would shift the burden to the employer to prove that the diagnosis was not work-related. So the business community is pretty fired up about that. Senate Bill 308 does not have that provision. I believe that the addition of that language was really to get Democrats on board. There is an emergency clause on this bill, and they may have needed to add this language in order to get the 2/3 majority that they needed to get this passed through the House. So you have 2 bills. The Senate bill has been passed by the Senate. The House bill has been passed by the House. Which bill moves? That's the $1 million question. We do not know at this point, but both chambers have said that this is a priority. I'll talk about the legislative calendar a little bit later on, but the House is not in session right now. They do not have session scheduled until September. So the Senate, they are scheduled to meet every single month, at least once, leading up to the November election. So we'll see which chamber moves which bill.
Yeah, I mean, that'll be the interesting part is to see with the emergency clause necessary and giving the Democrats some power because of the emergency clause necessary to be able to get those votes is will they back off of that? And you know, that's a slippery slope that we run into that, you know, obviously given the nature of the work that those individuals do, that they have exposure to it. But as we've said with the PTSD bills, for mental with the workers' compensation is you know, you have a first responder who, you know, shows up to the scene of an accident and they get mental assistance from workers' comp, but the truck driver who was first on the scene and helped administer aid, you know, why don't they get it? And so that, I mean, there's definitely a legal argument that can be made that, you know, if you have one, then you should have the other. So yeah, that's obviously something we're going to be watching pretty close.
Yeah.
So well, right prior to coronavirus, we had 100 people standing on a stage, all shoulder to shoulder behind the governor, to talk about distracted driving and texting and driving primarily. And so Senate Bill 285, Coonsey and O'Brien introduced on distracted driving. Let's kind of give the group an update on where we're at on that one.
Yeah, and this goes back to all, I say the feel-good bills. There were a lot of good pieces of legislation that OTA was helping spearhead that just got pushed to the back burner because of the pandemic. And this distracted driving bill is one of them. Governor DeWine has made this a priority. He announced it early on that he wants to revise the laws surrounding the use of handheld devices while driving. He wants to make it a primary offense. And he often references drunk driving, and he wants individuals, Ohioans, to view distracted driving like drunk driving and really change people's mindsets. And I view it as, you know, wearing a seatbelt. For a while, it was tough to get people to wear a seatbelt. Now the younger generations do it without even thinking. And I think that is where the governor wants to get with distracted driving, where no one picks up their phone. They don't even think about it. So the bills received 2 hearings in the Senate. And Tom, you provided testimony. It has a whole slew of proponents. We do expect a little bit of pushback in the House. There's been, this isn't a new issue. It's been introduced in every GA since I can remember. And it's something that some lawmakers just view as, you know, the government telling individuals what to do and a government overreach. So, and if you do it for handheld devices, there's other types of distracted driving out there as well. That isn't just a handheld device. So I do expect a hurdle in the House, but we will say this does have more momentum than in previous attempts. So hopefully we can see that through to the finish line if things get back to normal in the next 6 months.
Well, yeah, and that's, you know, the interesting part is that we, you know, obviously distracted driving. The statistics show that it is worse than drunk driving. In some cases, it is worse than drunk driving. And you know that yes, there are other things like eating and listening to music and all those other things, but it doesn't register as high. But let's be honest, the House has been very vocal about government overreach when it comes to dealing with coronavirus. And you've got a couple lightning rods in that group that are, you know, talk a lot about that. So I can see how this is. And you've got a couple folks who have been longtime opponents of this from, you know, from a legal standpoint, Sites being one of them. So there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done. But yeah, there is a pretty strong coalition this time around that. It's not just the normal group that's there. It's some pretty high powered business organizations that are part of it as well. So
well, and this, Tom, if I can just interject, this is a great bill because if you do this, you save lives. You know, there's many pieces of legislation out there that suggest, hey, if you do this, it might lead to X or Y. The facts are there. If we pass this bill, lives will be saved. And there's a few pieces of legislation that you can guarantee that lives will be saved if you pass, you know, X or Y piece of legislation, and this just happens to be one of them.
well, not to mention the legal payouts and insurance costs in relation to especially trucking companies, you know, that regardless of fault, we always tend to end up in court trying to defend ourselves. That, you know, you make distracted driving a primary offense, you reduce the amount of it being out there, and we all know that the vast majority, 80+% of the traffic accidents are the fault of, the passenger vehicle doing something wrong. And that was pre-distracted driving. That was pre-texting and driving when that research was done. I think that we've probably seen some significant increases in that percentage because of distracted driving. And that's just anecdotal information I get from talking with drivers. But some of the stuff they see on the roads is directly related to texting and driving. So let's talk a little bit about House Bill 372, which is a extension of the CDL renewals to 8 years, which is allowable for all of us. On the passenger vehicle side, I mean, I have my CDL, so I can only extend it out to 4. So let's talk a little bit about where that's at.
Yeah, this is another bill introduced by Representative Derek Marin in Northwest Ohio. This is a bill that should not be held up at all. This is a bill that I think should be moving fairly quickly. It would give Ohioans the option to renew their license, including a CDL, every 8 years as opposed to every 4 years. About 24 other states allow this, so it's not groundbreaking. It's nothing new, and unfortunately, we were kind of asked to lead the charge on this one. Representative Marin thought of it and said it's a great idea, but there really wasn't a group clamoring for it, and then came along and kind of took the torch and ran with it. And I think it's a really great bill. Seems to cut government red tape and kind of expedite the process. So I hope we can get this finished. It's still pending in the House Transportation Committee. Gosh, I could see something like this maybe being punted until next year. We'll have a transportation budget next year, but we'll see. Something can happen in lame duck session when lawmakers return after the election. But this to me just seems like a common sense bill.
So something we've been working on for quite a while is a package of 4 bills that we call Trucking Employment Acts, one of which was the military CDL conversion piece. Which is actually something that we've been working with Congressman Balzer about, as well as the FMCSA, because that request has already been put into the agency, and we're just waiting to hear back from them. But 2 remaining pieces that we have on the table is a tax credit for finishing schools, as well as a scholarship program, half grant, half loan, to go to CDL school. So kind of the 2 phases to getting people into the industry. Kind of thought that these were dead in the water as soon as they started siphoning money off for coronavirus. But let's talk a little bit about where that activity is and what we think is the prognosis going forward.
Yep. So House Bill 222, that's the training tax credit that Tom talked about, introduced by Representative Stoltzfus from the Canton area, and then Representative House up in the Cleveland area. Bipartisan support for this bill. It would authorize an income tax credit for businesses that spend money on training drivers. Employers would be eligible to receive up to half their training expenses in a tax credit, up to $25,000. So if you spend $50,000 training drivers, you would get a $25,000 tax credit. The full program would allow up to $1.5 million in credits awarded each year. And that's why, Tom, you mentioned the budget hole that we're facing. It makes it a little bit of a harder battle, the fact that this is going to cost the state money. We were cooking with gas in the House. Before the pandemic, we were doing, this had a ton of support. We had near unanimous support on the House floor. And then obviously the pandemic hit. We have had one hearing in the Senate Ways and Means Committee, and that was sponsor testimony. And now what we're running into is just this cost. It's the $1.5 million per year. We might be able to change how we sell this to legislators, and that it would help trucking companies recover from COVID-19 and get drivers back into the career field. So we'll see what happens with that. I was surprised to see this get a hearing a couple weeks ago, given everything else that's going on, but hey, I'll take it, and hopefully we can get some momentum on that. The other bill, House Bill 386, this establishes the Commercial Truck Driver Student Aid Program. It's Representative Hoops and Representative Sobecki, both from Northwest Ohio. Bipartisan support. Again, they have been great sponsors. And this is another bill that had a ton of support before the pandemic. I mean, this thing was really moving. They were even looking at ways to expand this to more people, to allow more people eligible for this program. What we do, we create a $5 million loan/scholarship program for students attending CDL schools. And it wasn't just the Trucking Association pushing this. We had school groups backing this. We had community colleges backing this. And it really was just a great bill. It's something that's needed to help students get over that financial hurdle of attending CDL school. I mean, you can get a scholarship to, Tom, you used the example, major in basket weaving at Ohio State. Why can't you get a scholarship to go get a CDL? So it's something that's needed. It's had 2 hearings in the House. And again, the sponsors have been great to work with. They're not giving up. It was a $5 million scholarship program, and now we're looking at maybe reducing that to $1 million, which $1 million still puts a lot of folks in truck driving school. So I think that's something we can certainly live with, and hopefully it'll make it an easier sell to lawmakers when they return this fall.
Yeah, I mean, that'll be the interesting part is as the coronavirus response comes in and the budgeting continues to be impacted by the decisions being made and the response of consumers to see what continues to live, what continues to make it part of our of our plans. But I think from a perspective of the lawmakers going, like you said, I remember walking out of that hearing room after we testified. They were, everyone in that room, every member of the legislature that was in that hearing was 110% in support of everything that we were doing, and the idea and the concept of providing scholarships and loans for truck driving schools, and being able to pick that up, especially with some of the changes that were made during the budget that took some of that money away. So I still feel really good about that, and I still feel that we can spin this as a coronavirus employment response rate with all these folks that are unemployed, that, we're looking for new careers, looking for a career change. There again, everyone saw during coronavirus, the way people were responding to truck drivers, the way that dynamic has changed a little bit, as well as those drivers, for the most part, stayed employed, through this. So, obviously some parts of the industry got hit, had to lay some folks off. But that was probably shorter lived than people who were in the hospitality industry or the restaurants and that side of it. That there's a lot of folks in hotels and lodging and restaurants that aren't back to work because of this. That the truck driver is. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. So let's talk a little bit about the remaining legislative schedule. We've got some interesting games being played in the legislature as always. And as well as we've got an upcoming election, what does the legislative schedule look like for the rest of the year?
Yeah, and this is key, and it's also, everything I say is subject to change. It could change tomorrow. The Senate initially was going to take a brief recess after this week, and they just scheduled another session next week, next Tuesday. So everything's subject to change. Like I said, it's been a really hectic May and June as lawmakers have tried to respond to the pandemic. The House has, like I said, recessed, and they do not have a session scheduled until September, and then they'll return after the November election, and it'll be very, very hectic in what we call lame duck session. The Senate, I think, is going to be a bit more active this summer. Like I said earlier, they have sessions scheduled at least once each month leading up to the November election. And then certainly when they return in November and December, it's going to be extremely, extremely active. To the House's credit, the reason they've been able to take this break, they were able to pass dozens of bills last week. They had a marathon session that went into the early morning hours, and passed dozens of bills. And they felt like they were able to address everything that needed to be addressed immediately. But we'll see what happens with COVID-19 if there's another flare-up. We'll see if there's some federal action that takes place that requires the state to respond as well. So all of that is subject to change. It is important to note that since we are in the second year of the General Assembly, any bill that doesn't pass by the end of the year, it starts back at square one. So the trucking training bills truck driver training bills that we were talking about, if those don't get passed, we need to reintroduce them early next session and start back at sponsor testimony. And it can be a challenge because passing legislation is not easy. I know it happens, but there's a lot of work that goes in behind the scenes, even on a bill that seems to make sense. It's a challenge. So I would hate for that to happen, and that's why when you say lame duck, it's very, very chaotic, because you see lawmakers trying to pass as much as possible, because they understand if you don't get it done by the end of the year, you're starting back at square one. And that's when you see the thing called a Christmas tree bill, where you see dozens of amendments all added to the same bill, and that bill passed very quickly. It's great if you're trying to get your legislation passed, but it also puts us as advocates in a tough spot, because we need to make sure we don't get hit with any negative legislation as well. And it requires you to watch really every bill that's out there.
Yeah, and for the viewers, remember, if you have any questions, please go ahead and queue those up in the Q&A section. Just got an alert that just popped across today that the governor of Texas has paused their reopening plans in the state because of the new coronavirus cases, which includes requiring all hospitals in 4 counties, the major 4 counties in Texas, to suspend elective procedures to increase hospital capacity. I guess that's one of the things that Ohio has been very cautious about, the reopening plans, and something that is very interesting as we talk about this resurgence in the fall. I've always said, I hope we learn something from the first time we do this, that we have things better in place this time going forward, and we can watch some other states. So one thing that also just came out yesterday was New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut said that if you come from one of the hotspot states, which are 10 states, including South Carolina, where I am right now, that you have to quarantine yourself for 14 days after returning for one of those hotspot states. And the interesting part is we found out early this morning that the transportation industry and truck drivers who are in transit are not subject to that. So essential workers are exempt from that quarantine piece that's there. So kind of a lot of the things that we run into as well. So just kind of want to get that up on the books as for everyone's information. Let's talk 2020 elections. Obviously the state of Ohio does not have any of the state offices up for election 2020. But we do have a presidential election coming forward, and we do have some interesting voting protocols that are going to be put into place. So let's talk about 2020 elections.
Yeah, and Tom, like you said, trying to learn from past experiences. I hope the general election is not a mess like the primary election. I know, Frank LaRose, our Secretary of State, a few people work harder than him, and I'm sure he's going to be prepared for the election in November. But again, everything can change if there's another spike or an outbreak. So we need to watch that closely. I hope there aren't any issues. It is while we don't have any statewide offices on the ballot, it is a major election. We have all 99 Ohio House seats up, nearly half the Ohio Senate seats up. There's 2 Ohio Supreme Court races. Republicans do hold a 5-2 majority on the court, but that could certainly flip. And then at the federal level, you have the presidential election, obviously, and then all of Ohio's congressional seats. So how does COVID-19 influence campaigning? That's the $1 million question. I think you're going to see a lot less door-to-door activity. You'll probably see a lot more mailers. We've been invited to participate in campaign webinars, to where candidates host webinars. Fundraising is going to be different, because you can't really have these massive fundraising events. So everything is certainly going to change, and maybe it's for the better. I'm a former staffer, and I had to go door to door all over Ohio. So if that goes away, I'm fine with it. But it also means we might get more emails, more phone calls, things like that. So I'm interested to see how campaigning is impacted by the virus. And I don't think it's just going to be for this election. I think if there are some changes, and data is key. If it shows that you can reach more people by doing X, what you were doing for the last 50 years might go away. So I think it's going to lead to changes to campaigning for years to come.
And I would agree. I think people are looking for other options on campaigning. The door-to-door piece has always been the staple, right? That's been, that's been what everyone has done. But I don't know that that has been all that effective. Primarily, I know when I've been working on campaigns, the vast majority of folks, end up hanging the door hanger on their door. That we're going to get to more mail, email, more data mining of those kinds of things, and probably more social media. That's being able to narrow that down, especially since you can basically define your area and anyone in that voting area, and that's who you're hitting. So I definitely think that that's going to change that dynamic pretty significantly, and things that you normally would spend your money on would be there. But the yard signs, I still think are going to be a staple for a really long time, right? So that's something that's part of it. So any questions from the viewers that we've got? We've pretty much exhausted what we've got, and so we'll kind of wait and see if we see any of those pop in. But no, it's been obviously been a very interesting time, and something that the members should be very proud of the work that OTA has done, and Governmental Policy Group has done, making sure that they keep up and running. The essential worker piece was something that, while the federal government had defined it, Ohio was really kind of working their way through that process and trying to figure out what's an essential worker and what isn't an essential worker. That we help them define that, and making sure they understood that if they want to continue to have goods and services and being brought around and open, and then product being on shelves, that is something that is vitally important that we have there. So, well, Andrew, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us and talk with us a little bit about where we're at and where we are legislatively. Next week for OTA on the Air, we're going to do a recap of the economic studies that we've been doing with OTA since the start of this. It's been some really great data that we've got in working forward. So we're going to go through a pretty deep data dive on what those things mean, what we're seeing as far as employment numbers go for the trucking industry, and loads and revenue, moving our way forward, and pull from some other stuff. So that will be next week, and the week after that, which is July 9th, we believe that we've got Congressman Balderson, who sits on Transportation and Infrastructure, on as well. So, and then one other that popped in is a really good question: is any updates on the trailer plate program, the permanent trailer plate program? Andrew, you want to talk a little bit about the work we've been doing with Representative Cross on that?
Yep, Representative Cross from the Findlay area has certainly kind of taken this and ran with it. The goal behind this, obviously, is to make Ohio more competitive in our trailer plating with states like Indiana and Maine. The problem that we're facing here in Ohio is there's a number of hands that go into to the fees associated with trailer registration. You get local governments involved, and all levels of local government, city, munis, and counties, I'm sorry, cities, townships, and counties. So there's a number of people that you have to work through, and when you're revising these laws. And so Representative Cross has been working with what's called the Legislative Service Commission, the attorneys for the state of Ohio, coming up with a program. And it's, like I said, it's somewhat difficult. We can't just say, hey, we're going to use Maine's numbers, or Maine's process, and then cut $5 off to undercut them, because it's all structured differently. So we have been working with Cross. Again, this was right before the pandemic hit, and then everything has kind of been pushed to the back burner. We were gaining some momentum. In fact, we were close to having a bill draft ready to go. The good news is we're laying the foundation. We found an advocate for us, a great advocate for us in Representative Cross. And the goal is that we might be able to make some reforms, bring in all the groups that need to be brought in from the ODOT, the governor's office, and then all the local government groups, county engineers, things like that, because they're going to be viewed as they're going to view this as, hey, you're taking money away from our construction projects and our roads. And I think the goal is to say, hey, if we do this, more trailers are going to be registered in Ohio, And long term, we're going to have more money coming into Ohio, because right now it's going to Indiana and it's going to Maine. And unless we do something, we're going to continue losing money. So hopefully this could be a win-win for everyone, for the trucking companies, and then also for the state and for the local governments as well. But a lot of work goes into this, and then right now it's just trying to get everybody on the same page, which is easier said than done.
Yeah, and then I mean the challenge is selling that was the one thing that someone had asked me when I went from state government to running the North Dakota Motor Carriers Association. Was what they asked me what the most significant change was, and I told them I now have to generate revenue. The government is used to having money there. They don't understand having to generate more revenue, having to change your pricing model, having to compete in that environment. They're just used to having money in a bucket. And I think that's the challenge is getting government to think in an entrepreneurial way, and in being able to, as a competitive nature, to say, hey, this is an opportunity to compete with these other states, and people aren't just doing this out of the goodness of their heart to say, hey, I'm staying in Ohio. They're looking for the most economical solution out there, and that's why they're going to these other states. So and that's our job to sell that to them as well. So yeah, I mean it's definitely a heavy lift. It's one that is always a challenge. It's one that is something that a lot of government entities struggle with, is because they're used to having that straight line revenue, even though it's probably declining as more people go out. But I think from the conversations we've had with members is, I would rather keep my money in Ohio as an Ohio-based company, but the necessity of operating a business dictates that I'm not going to pay Ohio $500, over the course of the life of this trailer, when I can pay Indiana $84, or I can pay Maine $150. And it just doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any business sense. So it's something that we fixed with the in-state, out-of-state trailer registration, truck registration, and I think we got a very good case moving forward on that as well.
Mm-hmm.
All righty. Well, Andrew, again, thank you so much. Thank you to the viewers, and we'll talk to you all next week. Thanks.